Someone I want to see.
My friend Sherlock Holmes.
221B Baker Street.
Hello there. Welcome to my review of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, Episode 3, The Naval Treaty. The episode begins in typically mysterious fashion with a raging thunderstorm and the shouts of an unknown figure as he's shepherded into a house where he continues to rave in great distress. I really enjoy these opening teasers. Out of context they make very little sense, but they provide intrigue the first time you watch and are fun Easter eggs on rewatches. The story proper begins at 221B Baker Street.
You come at a crisis, Watson.
As the series goes on, the apartment becomes a character in its own right, a familiar and comforting refuge for the characters, and a welcome sight for viewers, taking on now famous characteristics piece by piece. And this episode gives us two, as Holmes references the Persian slipper where he keeps his tobacco.
Help yourself to tobacco from the Persian slipper. I shall be at your service in an instant.
And Watson notices Holmes has gotten trigger happy, firing the Queen's insignia, VR, into the wall for reasons not explained. Both would become character trademarks. The scene itself is also very evocative. Holmes working over his chemistry set with coloured liquids bubbling away as he conducts his experiments. It's a scene used in several of the adaptations as he resolves what he calls a commonplace little murder.
If this remains blue, all is well. If it turns red, it's a man's life. I thought as much.
This is the genius of Doyle's writing, being able to create intrigue that is never resolved but doesn't feel like it's cheating the audience. Occasionally writers will use unresolved intrigue as part of the main plot or to establish a cliffhanger ending, but I've always felt this is a bit cheap, and the way Doyle deploys it is to give you something memorable that is inconsequential to the main plot but that allows you to speculate long after you've finished the story, or forget about completely if you choose to. Watson is there with a far juicier case than the one Sherlock has just completed. A letter from an old school friend, Percy Phelps. The letter describes Percy's career at the Foreign Office, thanks to his uncle. That has gone very much wrong and requires Holmes's assistance. Holmes comments that there is very little to go on other than the letter was written by a woman.
No, man, surely.
No, a woman's.
Graphology, or the study of handwriting to determine personality, has been debunked as a pseudoscience. But when this episode was written, it was still believed you could determine the gender of the writer. This has since been challenged as the success rate is about the same as tossing a coin, but I'm still willing to give Holmes the benefit of the doubt here, as the education system in Victorian England was very different to how it is now. So I wonder if there was a particular way of writing that educated women were taught that differed from men's handwriting. Holmes decides to take the case, and the two men head to the country. Here they meet Percy's brother-in-law-to-be, Joseph Harrison, and he has a very interesting exchange with Holmes.
I perceive that you yourself are not a member of the family.
Of course. You see my JH monogram. Now, for a moment, I thought you'd done something clever.
This exchange serves to indicate that Harrison is a fiercely intelligent man himself, as he is quick to spot Holmes's methods without the need to have them explained, and dismisses them as a trick equally as quickly. They go to see Percy, and he is the man that we saw ranting in the prologue, struck down with what they call brain fever, but which we would more likely recognise as depression or severe panic attacks. Percy gives the men the full story, how as a clerk in the Foreign Office he was responsible for handling some sensitive documents, in this case a naval treaty between Britain and Italy that the French or Russians would pay handsomely for. He shares his office with another clerk who leaves shortly before Percy starts working on the sensitive document. He was due to meet Joseph, so worked quickly, but was getting tired, so called for some coffee. A woman, claiming to be the wife of the commissionaire, took the order. Percy had never seen the woman before, and after a while without the coffee arriving, he went to see the commissionaire to see what the delay was, leaving the document out in the open. He finds the commissionaire asleep, and as he waits for the coffee, the bell in his office rings. He naturally rushes back up. The document has disappeared, leading to Percy's current malady. Percy called the police, and they naturally went to the commissionaire's house to check on his wife. She arrives after them, and it seems she was in no way involved. That is the mystery and the main drive of the plot now. Who took the treaty, and where is it? It seems like an impossible mystery, if it wasn't the commissionaire's wife, and the story goes to such lengths to make it clear that it wasn't her. It would be a deeply unsatisfying twist if she did end up being responsible, and yet the story is structured in such a way that it remains a possibility. After all this information, Holmes gives an impromptu speech relating to flowers.
What a lovely thing are roses. We have much to hope from the flowers.
That confuses and annoys Percy's fiancée.
Do you see any prospect of solving this mystery, Mr. Holmes?
Who has been with Percy the whole time. I can't be sure, but I think that's the purpose of the speech. To test her sincerity.
It would be absurd to deny that the case is abstruse and complicated.
Do you see any clue?
You have furnished me with 7, but I must put them to the test before I can pronounce on their value.
Holmes has a working theory, but presumably having learned from mistakes in Scandal in Bohemia, he wants to test his theory. The majority of the rest of this episode is Holmes investigating, and it's something we've not really seen in the series so far. As I watched, I was reminded in some ways of the structure of a Columbo episode. Obviously, we don't know who the culprit is here, but once you do, and spoilers, it's Joseph Harrison, the similarities become clearer, and you view how Holmes conducts his investigations very differently. Through this lens, I think it's made fairly explicit that Holmes knows who the culprit is as soon as Percy has finished his story. This is definitely hinted at during a pause in Percy's story when Holmes speaks with Harrison and asks some very pointed questions.
May I ask you what your occupation is that allows you to while away the summer in working?
And then apologises if he comes off as rude.
My apologies if my question offended you.
Much as Columbo often does. Then, when further investigating, the questions he asks other potential suspects are not about how they might have been involved, but about the practicalities of committing the crime. He's not really interested in anyone else. Watson is usually the one who asks questions pertaining to other suspects. Holmes is merely checking on his own theory, and this is where it differs from Columbo. as he uses the time to locate the missing document. The similarities are further compounded when Harrison attempts to throw suspicion away from himself while appearing to be helpful.
I think I may have found the spot where the fella scaled the wall.
And Holmes setting a trap for Harrison. While Doyle obviously did not take inspiration from Columbo, it would be interesting to know if the writers of Columbo took inspiration from this story.
There is one other very important point.
One other thing.
Sherlock is a very different character, but I thought it was interesting how the two characters' methods overlapped somewhat here. This is where the similarities end, however, as we are let into how the case is affecting Holmes. He is shown to be somewhat troubled by the case, or possibly the effects of the outcome. It's possible he hasn't quite put all the pieces together, or that he is concerned about the consequences for Percy when it's revealed that his brother-in-law-to-be is the culprit, something which could end his engagement. This worry seems to be gone after an attempt is made to break into the room where Percy is convalescing, and Sherlock asks a favour of Miss Harrison, which she accepts. He is in much better spirits now, so clearly has reached a satisfactory conclusion in his own mind. It's really interesting to see how solving a case affects Sherlock's mood, depending on the resolution. In this case, he feels he can solve the mystery and save Percy without it damaging his relationship with Miss Harrison. And so he is buoyant and joyful, putting paid to the idea that Holmes is somehow cold and uncaring. Brett Holmes is a strongly emotional one, and displays those emotions regularly. Solving a case is not enough for him if the conclusion is not satisfactory. As we see in the previous episode, The Dancing Men, and yet when he loses Irene Adler in the first episode, he's not depressed by the outcome, because the outcome itself is still satisfactory. This is such an interesting dimension to the character, because it means he doesn't always have to triumph by the end of the story, and quite often doesn't. It's so rare in detective stories that the hero can fail by story's end, and yet the story is still enjoyable, and is one of the things that sets Holmes apart. In this case, though, he does not fail. But we don't see his success firsthand, just the build-up to it, followed by him relaying what happens to Watson and Percy via flashback. And he has acquired an injury.
Oh, come along, Holmes. That bandage tells of adventures. Now, what happened?
It would have been easy enough to show what happened in real time, as it adapts the narrative for television, but chooses not to, in order to show more of Holmes's character. He is theatrical and a natural storyteller, as demonstrated when he surprises Percy with the naval treaty in a dramatic reveal.
Oh, well, then I suppose you have no objection to helping me.
Before explaining how he caught Harrison, deducing that he had hidden the treaty in the room he was staying in, but then was unable to retrieve it, as Percy had been there ever since convalescing. Getting Percy away from the room for a night, while Miss Harrison stayed until Holmes was ready, would allow him to catch Harrison and discover exactly where the document was. It's even more interesting that he lets Harrison go, rather than call the police, tipping them off sometime later. He says this is to protect Percy's reputation, but is just as likely to have been to spite the inspector who had been so rude to Holmes earlier in the investigation. The final piece of the puzzle is why the bell in Percy's office rung. This is the part of the mystery that really piqued Holmes' interest, and the reason is that when Joseph went to Percy's office, he hadn't planned to steal the treaty, and only noticed it and its value after he had rung the bell. What we have in these first 3 episodes is 3 very different stories with very different outcomes that show off different aspects of Holmes's personality, and it's an absolute joy to watch. Watson has less to do here than in the last 2 and is less involved, because if Holmes revealed to him what was happening, that would have also revealed it to us, which I don't think I would have minded, but wasn't the convention of the story, so when they do speak about the case, it's usually a red herring. The only real moment he gets is when he gets to use some of his medical training and asks Sherlock to take it easy with Percy, showing more of his caring nature, but that's very brief. Even so, this is a really entertaining story, with more great detail of Holmes's character and a satisfying resolution. It's a perfectly self-contained story, perfectly paced for the show length, and the only potential criticism I have is that while I like the way the fight between Holmes and Harrison is staged, seeing only their shadows, I don't think it quite works and could have done with a bit more rehearsal just to make it run more smoothly. Other than that, another fantastic episode. Thank you. Goodbye.